India, the world's fastest growing major economy, is rapidly becoming a promising market for Swedish companies. What are the opportunities ahead as India ramps up climate action and green investments? Get the inside view in this episode of Business Sweden News. India's economy accelerates amid global downturn. How can Swedish companies support sustainable development? And how will a free trade agreement between the EU and India impact market potential? India is in the spotlight as it overtakes China as the world's most populous nation, while also stepping into its new role as a manufacturing and logistics hub in Asia. With a rapidly expanding middle class and ambitious investments to transform its energy, infrastructure, and industries, India is on track to become the world's third largest economy by 2027, surpassing both Japan and Germany. Can India become the next green superpower? How can Swedish companies support the drive for sustainable development? And how will revived negotiations for a free trade agreement between the EU and India change the playing field? With me in the studio today, I have Cecilia Oskarsson, Sweden's Trade and Invest Commissioner to India. Welcome, Cecilia.
Thank you.
Let's start by exploring India's growing attractiveness for global companies. Why is India becoming a new supply chain hub in Asia?
India has been a supply chain hub for quite some time, maybe not the most important one, and I'm not sure it will be the most important one going forward. However, there are many factors that is making India more and more attractive in the future. One of those is, of course, the geopolitical alignment that India has, or maybe the strategic non-alignment, where India is placing itself as a very neutral partner. We're talking about friendshoring and regionalization, and here India will definitely play a role. They are also aligning with Quad, I2U2, etc. And companies today, American, European, even Eastern Asian countries like Japanese companies are definitely looking into investing and producing in India right now. Second of all, cost advantage of India is still there, not only labor cost, but also land, utility, and other concessional corporate tax advantages we can clearly still see. Further on, the Indian government is very much focused on different incentives like Make in India, Digital India, but also Skill India. And that is definitely promoting the domestic manufacturing. And fourthly, it's worth mentioning India's strategic location between Middle East, Africa, and Europe, with a very long coastline. And I do also want to mention that India has an enormous amount of young, English-speaking, very well-educated talent. The political environment is fairly stable when we compare to other parts of the world. And also, India has improved a lot on the ease of doing business lately.
And we know that India is ramping up its focus on sustainable development, and it's got quite an ambitious green transition strategy. Which specific industries are opportunities? Are there opportunities for Swedish companies?
There are opportunities for Swedish companies across all sectors, but maybe I can mention three. First one being, of course, life science. Second one, infrastructure, with the great Gati Shakti, the infrastructure scheme that is ongoing since some time, where especially aviation has focus for Swedish companies. And thirdly, we cannot help but need to mention green transition. Within green transition, we do have green energy, we have the green hydrogen, where many Swedish companies has the capacity to really meet the Indian demands here. And what we can do at Business Sweden is really connect them to the Indian partners.
And I can only imagine, I don't work in India, you do, but that business climate is quite different from what companies might have experienced in the West. How do Swedish companies navigate that, and how do they adapt when they enter the market?
I think one of the most important and the first thing you have to remember and you have to look into is the sheer size of India. Not only India has the biggest population of the biggest populated country in the world, but also India as a country is very big. So there is not one enter India strategy. you have to look where you enter and make maybe a few different strategies. And it's also very important that you definitely make up your mind on where you place your business and where you are. And it's also, as in many of the other Asian countries, very important that you do it long term. It's no point of toe dipping and think you will be able to handle India with your left arm. That's not going to work. I think you also have to factor in both the domestic demand, but also the global and export potential when you're looking into India. But at the same time, we do have to cope, and we have to bear in mind the quite complex bureaucratic processes, but also the equally time-consuming and sometimes very frustrating legal system, and also the complex tax system. I also would like to talk about the sometimes very protectionistic policies that we see in India, which, if you work with them in the right way, can actually play in your hands, like Make in India and all the PLI schemes, who actually, if you know how to use them and if they are in your sector, can actually benefit you, and there are economic gains to win for that. I also maybe should mention the demographic dividends in India, where there is a lot of skilled labor. But when it comes to blue collar workers, as a company, you do have to make sure that you invest in on the job training and maybe even sometimes vocational training. Of course, India has a specific culture, and there are culture differences between Swedish companies. And it's very important that we understand that there are many official languages in India. There are also very different business practices, and sometimes even different social norms that we are used to. So to sum up all this, there are tremendous opportunities for Swedish companies, but you do have to keep in mind also the challenges. And of course, we are always there to help when it comes to that.
And how do Swedish companies actually do that? I mean, how do they tap into those opportunities and find out where to enter the market and access those big potentials?
I think we have many Swedish companies who've been in the country for more than 100 years. They have good knowledge, so use them, but also use other organizations and local knowledge that can help you. It's almost impossible to enter as a small, medium-sized company to enter India on your own, but use the network that we have there.
Okay, now let's cross over to hear directly from two Swedish companies who are expanding their presence in India. First, to you, Rikard. Why is India an attractive market for Absortech, and in what industries are you seeing a growing demand for your supplies?
Well, I think if we look around in the world right now, there is a geopolitical situation where I mean, historically, China has been the factory of the world, and they do have the labor and they do have the output over there. But I think what people are doing now is to look for alternatives. But to do that, you need to find a country which is, I would say, not typically equal size China, but big enough to take on board the output that is needed. And there's where India comes into the picture. And I think also recently we see the bigger companies entering into India with companies like Apple. I think there are 7% iPhones this year. And when they enter the arena, then all their sub-suppliers and the electronical clusters will come. So for us, that means, of course, new potential business opportunities. So to reply to your question, what industries are we looking at? Well, we look at automotive, we look at electronics, agricultural, beverage. So very many of them takes India, I would say.
So that's quite a cross sector that you're working with there. Can you give us some examples of how you're helping those industries or others in India to reduce their environmental impact?
I mean, we as a company are having sustainability very high on our agenda. Basically, what we do is to protect shipments from being scrapped due to moisture damages. And of course, if India is taking on board more production now, that also means more export and more containers to be protected. And I mean, what we see and the steps taken now in India is very much sustainability in the forefront. And of course, again, it comes crossroads with what we are representing.
And to what extent do your customers in India value the fact that you're selling products manufactured in Sweden? How do they perceive Swedish suppliers?
I mean, historically, Sweden and India have had business together, and as countries, we know each other's a little bit. And I think the Indian perspective is that Sweden is representing high quality, it's representing sustainability, and again, coming back to the two things that we have discussed recently. So, sustainability in all, I mean, both the E and the S and the G in sustainability is sort of aligning with what India is doing currently.
Great. And Harmeet, your company Hitachi Energy has identified India as a key growth market, and you've recently inaugurated a manufacturing facility in Bangalore. Why is Hitachi Energy expanding in India, and how are you supporting the country's energy transition?
Thanks a lot. Just as a quick introduction, Hitachi Energy is in 90 countries, but of course, India is a key focus for us, but not just as a market. It's a focus for us as a market, as a manufacturing base, as an R&D hub, and as a major global engineering center as well. We've been in India now for more than 6 decades, and we have nearly 20 factories now across the country. So, it's a very extensive presence. And in fact, you brought up, Sarah, the Bangalore factory. After that, we also commissioned another one in Chennai. So we've now basically commissioned 3 new manufacturing units in the last 2 years. So it is a rapid expansion as well from the point of view. Again, coming back to your original question about what is prompting this to a great extent, we're in a very sweet spot in terms of the energy transition. And so the energy transition is capturing really pace across the world. India has set some very stringent targets, including ambitions like adding 500 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. It's all part of the 2070 carbon neutrality journey. But I think a country with 1.4 billion people now. Almost the largest population in the world. And again, historically, India's electricity consumption is still way below global averages. So the consumption of electricity in India will not just continue to grow, but grow rapidly. And of course, the focus is more and more on clean electricity. And that's where we come in, and especially in terms of the transportation of that electricity from the points of generation to the points of consumption.
So you've scaled up quite a lot in the last few years in India, but how has the local market and the workforce been able to deliver the skills for your new manufacturing operations?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, one of the most frequently asked questions for us nowadays, given that the energy transition is catching pace in all parts of the world, is the supply chain topic, right? In terms of, how do we manage the supply chain? How do we keep pace with this rapidly increasing demand? And I think often a topic that is sort of a little bit under-focused on is the topic of resources. I mean, the question is not only going to be about whether the supply chain can cope with this all increasing demand across the world, but the people that are required to deliver the energy transition. And I think here India is really in a gifted place because of the fact that I don't think there is any other country at the moment where we can add, for example, skilled engineers, because in our business, you need to have a lot of skilled engineers working on projects across the world. And I mean, to be honest, we set up a few years ago a global engineering and operations center in Chennai. It started with a couple of hundred people, and we're close to 2,000 and growing. So at the end of the day, I think the availability of those kind of skilled resources who can work not only to serve the Indian market, but also in our case, we leverage it as a global resource hub.
Absolutely. And you touched on there that you're working across industries and you're working with the energy transition. But what gaps need to be bridged to make the renewable energy accessible not only to those critical industries, but to India's vast population?
I think that's a great question, but if I can sort of turn it a bit on its head and not call them gaps to close, but enablers and catalysts, then I think one thing that we need to acknowledge is that for a vast country of that size and scale, right, you need to act on all fronts. And India has made a lot of progress over the last few years. If I really look at simplifying, for instance, policies, regulations, the whole sort of reducing the red tape and the bureaucracy and so on and so forth. But of course, the whole point at the moment is that technology is not a bottleneck. Us as technology providers, the main thing is to be able to deploy that technology at speed and at scale. And I think for that, we need all the stakeholders to cooperate and collaborate. And that starts with, the policymakers, the regulators, and then the TSOs, the DSOs, and all elements of the value chain, I think, that need to come into it. So I would say, I think we need to continue simplifying processes and procedures, continue to make it an attractive investment location. And I think, again, some things that sometimes, in the context of the energy transition, just want to mention this point that when we talk about global warming and, mitigation of climate change, the point is, a dollar spent is a dollar spent, and a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. So the value you get if you invest, for instance, in emerging markets like India, for the same amount of dollars spent, you can get a lot more in terms of sequestrating the carbon footprint than you may get in a mature market where the dollar doesn't go that far. So I think there's huge potential for a vast population like that to continue, driving in that direction.
How have you navigated some of those complexities, and has the business landscape changed or improved recently?
So again, how you navigate, I mean, this is our experience. And if our roots are basically in the power business of ABB, and, it goes all the way back to ASEA, where we now more than 130 years of legacy, added to it the 100+ years of the Hitachi legacy. But the main point and I think this is very much in our DNA, that when we are in countries like India or other places, it's the whole concept of thinking global but acting local. And I think that's the most important point, is that in India, we are an Indian company. So at the end of the day, we manufacture, we employ people from the country, we have, the management is from the country and so on. So I think that is a very critical element.
Okay, thank you. And Rikard, you're on the other side of the spectrum. You're a small, medium-sized Swedish company. What has been your experience breaking into India, and what would your recommendations or advice be to those Swedish companies looking to go into India?
Well, it's true what you say. Of course, we need companies like the transformed ABB, let's say now Hitachi, to take the forefront. They speak on the high level, of course, politically and regulation-wise and so forth. But once established, you come into the supply chain part where we play a role. So, I mean, for us, it's a little bit like follow John. We need the big players to be present for us to be able to launch business together with them, let's say.
And do you think it's a market that other Swedish companies should be looking at?
I definitely think so. For one, I've been to India so many times, and I always I even invested pension money in India ages ago because I thought this country will take off. But now it seems like it is taking off, and you can start to see more and more concrete things going on. So definitely I would recommend more people and more companies to intervene in the Indian market if they have the ability to do so.
Okay, and Cecilia, we've heard a lot about what's happening on the ground there, but another topic that's hot on the mouths of people talking about India is the negotiations around a free trade agreement between India and the EU, and they have resumed. How soon will these negotiations be concluded, and what impact will this FTA have on the market's future potential?
Maybe I can start by saying that EU is very important for India. It's actually the ranking as number 2 in bilateral trade for India. And last year it witnesses a growth of nearly 40+%, a huge amount. So it is super important for both areas, both EU but also for India. Of course, it will increase the trade, but also the investment going back and forth. We hope that it could conclude this year, 2023. It would have been great to see it during Sweden's presidency of EU. But let's see. End of the year is a great achievement, even that. And one very, very important aspect of this is to unify the standard measurements between EU and India. And that's where I think it's quite far off yet.
Okay. Now, Harmeet, thinking about that, if this FTA is signed, how will this change or shape Hitachi's business and future potential in India?
I think it's a very good question, and I don't want to reiterate, by the way, what Cecilia already said, which is all extremely valid. I think both are complementary. That means the EU is important to India, and India is important to the EU as well. And I think some of the discussion we had recently, and you also brought up a few minutes back, for instance, the areas of skills and technology transfer and so on and so forth. So in principle, for a company like us who operates across the world, it is extremely important to have the ability to leverage our global footprint, because there is no way that we can manufacture everything everywhere. And while, of course, in India, we have a lot of factories manufacturing for the Indian market, but we also export out of India. It's the same, as I said, that we have engineering skills and R&D skills that we leverage out of India, and vice versa. So we have also the people exchange between Sweden and India. Of course, we have a lot going on in Sweden as well in terms of our Ludvika facility, etc. So I think importantly, in the context that you mentioned, it's important to have as few barriers as possible and to be able to leverage these global footprints for supply chains, for people, skills, etc.
Great. And Rikard, this FTA has been on the table for quite some time, nearly a decade now. Was it a factor in your decision to expand in India? And do you have any contingencies in place if and when the agreement is signed?
I mean, we were in India beforehand this took place, and also at that time, local production of the products that we are creating was also a bit questionable. So it was bringing sort of a higher quality into the Indian market. Now we can supply India either from Sweden or from China. So I mean, the FTA is of course creating new possibilities, but we also need to look into how that will impact our supply chain. But in general, I mean, FTAs are good things. That's in my DNA. It simplifies life, definitely.
Thank you very much. Now, Cecilia, government support for green projects is high on the political agenda all around the world. There's the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the Green Deal Industrial Plan in the EU. What are the latest incentives and grants in India that are supporting the green transition, and how can Swedish companies tap into those?
As we heard before, India has announced that it will become carbon neutral by 2070, which can be a little bit not so ambitious in our minds. However, looking at where India is today, where 70% of the energy comes from coal, it is quite good to reach there by 2070. And already by 2030, the country has a plan to have 50% of the energy by fossil-free fuel. To really go for that, the National Action Plan for Climate Change has been rolled out, and it's really facilitating for the green transition journey. And we see that it includes different sectors, but of course, energy, transport, agriculture, and water, but also urban development. And there is a lot of spendings being done right now within the clean energy area, and then especially in green hydrogen, but also other kinds of renewable energy. But more, or maybe not more important, but very important to also notice is that the companies are actually being much more aggressive. So the Indian industrial groups, many of them have targets which are 2030 or even 2040 for their own carbon neutrality, like Mahindra Group, but also Tata Consulting Service. What also is very interesting to notice is that these industrial groups are also investing a lot in sunrise sectors such as green hydrogen and renewable energy in order to really leverage on their business opportunities.
There are plenty of incentives and lots of opportunities going on in India.
There are.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you to Rikard and Harmeet for joining me. And now, to get a deeper understanding of India's new role as a global economic force, I'm joined in the studio now by Henrik Titan Aspengren. He's from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, how would you describe India's rise? What has changed in the last decade in terms of influence on the global stage?
I think decades of high economic growth has placed India in a much better position to act on its interests. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think geopolitical developments. We see companies trying to de-risk from China. India becomes an actor here, and that places India in a much sweeter spot than it previously was. Third, I would say domestic developments. There are demographic dividends where a young population will be contributing to the economy. Also some changes and reforms internally that are beneficial for India.
Okay, and you do a lot of work analysing India-EU relations, and what's the assessment of India's ability to continue bridging tensions between the East and the West?
I think East and West tension, yes, but also South and North. I think that's quite important to bring in here, because India places developing countries' interests also on its agenda. So when we look at the G20 presidency, for example, that India is now having, I think development economies' interests are very high on India's agenda. When it comes to East-West relations, I would say that China is still India's primary strategic challenge. Relations with Russia are important, but the trajectory is towards the West. If we look at recent decade and also decades to come, India has a very strong and growing relationship with countries in the West. So it's both East-West, but also North-South.
So quite a pivotal role globally.
Yes.
Now, we've talked a lot about sustainability and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals is high on the agenda, but all countries, including India, need to play a critical role. What signs of progress are you seeing that India is able to ensure the rapid growth, but making it equitable at the same time?
I think India has done a tremendous job lifting people out of poverty. If we look at recent decades, I think that has been a huge achievement. But there is a question whether this huge amount of people are sort of lifted into a middle class, consuming stable middle class. That is a challenge for India. Also, there is a challenge with the gender aspect of this, because there is a lack of women in the labor force, and that needs also to be sort of accelerated. But when it comes to the green transition, India is very sincere in making that transition and sets aside quite a big chunk of its yearly budget to be able to make that transition.
And that cultural shift, that's going to take quite some time. How do you see that aligning with the economic growth?
You mean for the equitable?
Exactly, yes.
I think that it's on its way. There is still a lot of investments that needs to be done in healthcare and primary and secondary education. I think the awareness is growing, but there are still some challenges to that aspect.
And you touched upon the green transition. How well do you think Swedish innovations and sustainability know-how are matching India's needs in the green transition?
India has chosen Sweden for innovation partnership that is very important to India and also for Sweden, of course. I think there is a great match here. and the scale of India is important for Swedish companies. There are other countries, of course, where India is looking for that technological know-how as well. But I think there are good prospects.
And culturally, how is that fit between Sweden and India?
I think it's a good fit. I think there are differences, of course, in how we do things, how we think about innovation and its role in society. I think when it comes to the educational side, Indian universities are good, but there is still a lot of interest in the Swedish innovation system. So I think there are complementary roles here that will benefit both India and Sweden.
And our guests earlier touched upon the negotiations with the free trade agreement between the EU and India. Now, what's your view on the outlook for stronger trade relations between Sweden and India?
I think there is a great interest from both parties to have stronger trade relations. There is a shift that needs to be, that is on its way, I would say, but could perhaps be more accelerated as well on the Indian side, to think of India not only as a big market, but also a hub in value chains. And that is a thing that is slowly shifting. When it comes to the EU and India, I think the free trade agreement is essential to build a very robust economic cooperation. I'm not that sort of positive that it will happen before the end of this year, probably perhaps in 2024 after the elections, but we will see. India has never done a trade deal of the kind that is now attempting with the EU. Previous ones with Australia, the one negotiated right now with the UK, with the UAE, there are smaller deals compared to what the EU is looking for. So it's a new thing, but the political will is there, both on the EU side and the Indian side. I think the Indian side has shown great interest in getting this deal done.
And do you think this deal is a major component of the future of sustainability in India?
I think it is, absolutely. And I think it's very important to India for other reasons as well. India is not part of these great regional trade deals, and so it's opting for bilateral trade deals. And I think the one with the EU will set a standard and would be a great achievement if it's concluded.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your insights and for your time and your expertise.
Thank you.
And that's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode of Business Sweden News.